The kitchen was warm. Not the warmth of company, not the warmth of bodies gathered around food and conversation. The warmth of ovens left running because no one had thought to turn them off. Mechanical warmth. Indifferent warmth. The kind that filled a room without caring who was in it. Her antlers lowered. The cook didn't know what it meant. The two guards at the door did. One of them reached for his weapon. The other stopped him. The story doesn't start there. It starts with a 1,400-day silence. Her name was Ilian, Matriarch of the Lirati, sovereign of 11 systems, holder of the white antler accord that had kept 3 wars from happening and 1 from continuing. She was 5 feet and 5 inches of powder blue velvet fur and bone-white silence. And she ate alone in the palace kitchen every night after the staff went home. Not because protocol demanded it, because the alternative was eating in the state dining room, where the chair at the head of the long ceremonial table had 62 empty seats arranged beside it, and the quiet in there had teeth. The kitchen quiet was different. It was the quiet of things that had already finished their purpose for the day. Cooling pans, stacked bowls, a prep counter wiped clean, things that had been used and put away and asked nothing further of anyone. She understood that kind of quiet. Lirati antlers are not decorative. The bone-white arcs that rose from her skull, curving forward and then gently outward, were as expressive as a face. More, perhaps, because they could not be schooled. A Lirati can train her voice to evenness. She can make her warm green eyes go flat and professional. But antlers do not obey. They respond to threat by rising and spreading, to danger by pressing forward, and to the presence of someone her nervous system classified as safe. They lower, slow, involuntary, ancient as the species itself. A Lirati matriarch's antlers had not lowered in living memory. Not in the whole of recorded court history. Hayes had not lowered in 1,400 days. 4 years, 2 months, 11 days, if she had been counting. She had not been counting. She simply knew the number the way she knew the temperature of the kitchen and the weight of her antlers and the exact shape of the empty chair beside her at the long wooden table, its cushion flattened on one side where a shape had once pressed it and never returned. There was dust on the armrest. She had looked at it every evening for 4 years and had not touched it and had not asked anyone to clean it. Her fur lay flat against her arms in the kitchen warmth, and her antlers rose in their full formal height. And she sat down in her chair and opened the container of nutrient supplement that her physician had approved and her body had learned to accept and her heart had quietly, persistently refused to call food. She ate alone. The ovens hummed. Outside the kitchen door, 2 of her guards stood in the corridor and did not enter. No one entered. In 1,400 evenings, no one had entered. She looked at the empty chair. The cushion had lost its shape on the side that faced her. Pressed in and never released. The armrest had a faint bloom of dust that caught the kitchen light a certain way if she wasn't trying to see it. She was not trying to see it. She saw it anyway. If this story already has you by the throat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Stay close. We're just getting started. She had chaired 3 treaty negotiations that morning. 14 delegates, each representing a system with its own grievances and its own sense of historical priority, and she had moved between their positions with a kind of steady, frictionless authority that people mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She had learned to be still, and the 2 things looked identical from the outside. An aide had brought food to the chamber during the afternoon recess, set it on the side table, left without making eye contact. Another aide had stood near the window for several minutes in the particular way that meant they wanted to speak and had decided, once again, not to. The summit concluded at the 6th hour. She had signed 4 documents and exchanged formal farewells with each delegate and answered 17 questions from the diplomatic press and smiled in a way that reached exactly to the corners of her mouth and no further. Then she had walked to the kitchen. Her guards followed at the customary 3 steps. They stopped at the door. They always stopped at the door. Inside, cooling pans, stacked bowls, a prep counter wiped clean. And then, tonight, a man she had never seen before. He was at the far counter, not looking up, a cook's knife moving through a pile of root vegetables in long, steady strokes. Human, young, relative to her decades, but not young in a way that made you nervous for someone. Built low and solid, the way people built themselves when their work happened at counter height and required patience rather than speed. Brown hair, a small scar along his left forearm that had the specific flattened quality of an old burn, the kind earned at a hot pan rather than received and forgotten. He was humming, something with no discernible melody, a rhythm more than a tune, the way people hum when they are not thinking about humming. He did not look up when she entered. She stopped inside the door. In 1,400 evenings, no one had been in this kitchen when she arrived. The night prep staff had always finished before her. It was not protocol. No one had ever told the cooks to be gone before the matriarch came. They had simply learned the way staff learned things in palaces, by watching and adjusting and quietly disappearing at the right moment. This one had not learned yet. She stood at the door, considered leaving, considered the 62 empty seats in the state dining room and the particular quality of the quiet in there. She walked to her table, sat down, opened her supplement container. The man kept chopping. Her fur lifted along both arms, just slightly, the outer layer of it orienting itself toward the warmth at the far counter. She pressed it down. It was involuntary. She pressed it down anyway. He was humming. She had not heard anyone hum in this kitchen in 4 years. He was matriarch of 11 systems. He made broth. The universe had no reason to put them in the same room. It did anyway. He finished the vegetables around the time she was halfway through her supplement. He had not looked up once. He moved to the stovetop with the ease of someone had learned a kitchen the way you learn a piece of music, not by thinking but by repetition, and set a wide pot over the heat and began building a stock from the bones and trimmings he'd prepped earlier in his shift. The smell reached her before she expected it to. Not the antiseptic neutrality of her supplement. Not the careful, engineered nutrition of approved court provisions. This was something older. Marrow and root vegetables and something green she couldn't immediately name, and the low undertone of heat meeting fat in a way that her body recognized before her mind caught up. Real food. Someone making something real, unhurried, for no particular audience, because it was the thing that came next in the sequence of the evening. He was not cooking for her. He was cooking. She happened to be here. Her hands had stopped moving. She looked at them, at the half-open supplement container, and then, almost against her will, at him. A cook's hands. She had never paid particular attention to a cook's hands before. These were broad across the knuckles, carrying the particular cartography of repetitive work. The calluses built up in specific places that told you everything about how someone held a knife and for how long. The burn scar on the forearm, older than she'd first thought, was joined by smaller ones she hadn't seen at distance. Not carelessness. Occupational archaeology. Evidence of a person who had put their hands into heat for years because the work required it. He stirred the pot with one hand, checked something on the prep list tacked to the wall with the other, read it, nodded slightly to himself, and stirred again. He moved the way people moved when they were not performing their competence, when there was no one to perform for. Beneath the viewport of the kitchen's high clear-story window, the last light of the day shifted and went out. He poured 2 bowls. It was pure habit, a large kitchen habit, the kind built over years of feeding crews and staffs and whoever happened to be on shift, the automatic portion for the number of people present reflex. There were 2 people present. He poured 2 bowls. Then he looked up. She was at the table. He had known someone was at the table, some general awareness of a presence in the room, the way you know without cataloging it. He registered her now. Blue fur. Antlers. The kind of antlers that meant something, probably, but he was new to the palace and still assembling the hierarchy. He looked at the 2 bowls, looked at her, looked at the empty chair beside her. He picked up both bowls, walked to the table, set one in front of her, and pulled up the chair. 4 words. He sat down. The chair creaked. It was an old sound, the sound of wood adjusting to weight it hadn't carried in a long time. Fine particles of dust released from the armrest and drifted in the kitchen light, catching and vanishing. He pulled the second bowl toward himself and picked up his spoon. His hand was still on the back of the chair for a moment, settling his weight, and the warmth of it radiated outward, heat from a living body at close range, something that was not the impersonal warmth of ovens left running. Her fur responded before she could address it, every outer fiber along her left arm orienting toward that heat with a slow, specific intentionality that had nothing to do with her decisions. Her antlers ached at the base, where they connected to her skull, a pressure she had not felt in 4 years, something her body was considering. She looked at the bowl of broth in front of her, steam rising, simple and real, and put there by someone who had not asked her permission. She had not been asked in 1,400 days. She had not been simply included without negotiation, without formality, without the 14-step protocol that surrounded every interaction she had in the visible world. He had pulled up a chair. He was eating his broth. The kitchen hummed around them. The two guards at the door had seen the chair move. They had both watched this kitchen for 4 years. Between the two of them, rotating shifts, they had watched 1,400 evenings of the matriarch eating alone at that table. They knew the supplement container. They knew the way she opened it. They knew the exact quality of her stillness when she sat there, which was a different quality of stillness than her stillness in chambers or in negotiations, something that had more weight to it. They watched the new cook set a bowl in front of her. They watched him pull up the chair without asking. Neither of them moved. Not because they had decided not to move. Because the act was so outside any category they had been trained for that, their bodies took a moment longer than usual to arrive at a response. Her fur, from this angle, was visibly reaching toward him. Not pressed down. Reaching. The younger guard had served the matriarch for 2 years. He had never seen her fur do that. He looked at the older guard. The older guard's eyes were fixed on the table, on the chair, on the two figures sitting in the kitchen light. The older guard had served the matriarch for 11 years. His face said nothing. His hands, which had started to move toward force of habit, had gone very still at his sides. The chair that had been empty for 4 years had someone's weight in it. The kitchen felt different. Not larger, not warmer, just different. The way a room felt when the thing that was wrong about it was no longer wrong, and you hadn't known until that moment how much space the wrongness had been taking up. The older guard exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, the breath of someone deciding something. He did not reach for his weapon. The younger guard, watching him, did not reach for his either. At the table, the cook ate his broth. The matriarch had not moved. Her antlers had not moved. But in the light, the older guard could see the faint tremor at their base, the subtle, involuntary pull downward that any Lurati specialist would have recognized immediately, and that the cook, finishing his first bowl and glancing at Hayes to see if she'd started, did not recognize at all. She picked up his spoon. Something just shifted in that kitchen. Come back for part 2. You won't want to miss how this ends. She ate. The broth was simple. Marrow and root vegetables and whatever the green thing was, something he'd added late, a handful from a bunch hanging near the window. It had no name she recognized on the approved provisions list. It had not been cleared by her physician or reviewed by her dietary committee or sourced through the palace supply chain with the appropriate documentation in triplicate. It was the best thing she had tasted in 4 years. She did not think about that. She thought about the spoon, the motion of it, the way the steam came off the surface and dissipated before it reached her face. She thought about the bowl, which was a plain kitchen bowl, and glazed at the rim, the kind used by staff rather than court, which meant he had not chosen a ceremonial bowl for her or searched for something appropriate to her rank. He had given her the same bowl he had given himself because there were 2 people and 2 bowls, and that was the whole of the logic. Her fur was still reaching. She did not press it down. Across from her, he finished his bowl, set his spoon inside it, and rested his forearms on the table in the easy way of someone who was not thinking about his forearms. He was not leaning back with performance. He was not leaning forward with attention. He was simply present in the way that people were present when they were not trying to be anything in particular. The kitchen settled around them. The low tick of the stovetop cooling. The far hum of the ventilation system, which had a particular low frequency she had always found easier to sit with in silence. Steam still lifting from her bowl in slow curls. She breathed in, out. The base of her antlers ached steadily, the way a muscle ache that had been held rigid for too long and was being asked, gradually, to release. She did not look at him. She did not need to. Her body already knew where he was. It had been tracking the heat from his forearms on the table, the proximity of his shoulder to the air beside her shoulder, the small sounds of his breathing, which was even and unhurried and entirely unaware of what it was doing to her nervous system. Everything she had built, every layer of stillness and professional distance, and the particular armoring that came from being matriarch of 11 systems for 4 years without anyone to sit beside her, was conducting a slow, silent negotiation with a biology that was older than all of it. Her antlers ached. The kitchen was warm. He was still there. Still. He looked up. Not dramatically. He looked up the way you looked up when you were deciding whether to say something or let it go, a small internal calculation visible only as the slight pause before his eyes moved from the table surface to her face. Her antlers, she realized, had been lowering. She had not noticed. She had been paying attention to the bowl and the broth and the practiced neutrality of keeping her hands steady, and in the meantime her antlers had been making their own separate decision. They were not all the way down, but they were no longer at their formal height. They had descended by degrees, the bone-white arcs curving closer to the horizontal than she had allowed in any documented interaction in the past 4 years, in any room, with any person. She did not know how long it had been happening. That was the worst part. Not that it was happening, but that she had not known. That her body had found a moment of inattention and used it. He was looking at her antlers now. Curious, without alarm. The particular expression of someone encountering something they don't have a category for yet and aren't frightened by the absence of the category. He did not know what it meant. She could see that plainly. The 2 guards at the door knew. The older one's hand had moved halfway to his side before going still. The younger one had turned his head to look at his senior officer for guidance and received none. Because the senior officer was also still, watching the table, watching the antlers, understanding at a biological and ceremonial level what was happening and having absolutely no protocol for what to do about it. For Lirati, antler descent was not a gesture. It was not a choice. It was the oldest truth the species carried in its nervous system, older than language, older than law. It meant, my body has decided you are safe. It meant, I am not performing safety. I am experiencing it. For a matriarch, whose antlers carried the symbolic and biological weight of her entire standing, it was the most private act possible. More intimate than any formal ceremony. More vulnerable than any treaty signed with her name. She had not lowered her antlers in 1,400 days. She was not choosing to lower them now. Her body had chosen. It had found one person in 1,400 days who had sat beside her without asking permission, without looking at her rank before looking at her, without performing anything for an audience, and it had made its determination before she could stop it. She stared at her own antlers reflected in the surface of the broth. The long bone-white curves, tilted downward, exposed. She thought, I should raise them. Her antlers did not raise, which was when she understood that it was already done. He set down his spoon, looked at her, then at the antlers, then back at her face with the same open, unalarmed expression. He was working something out. She could watch him work it out without it feeling like an examination, which was itself strange. Same time tomorrow. 3 words. He said them the way he said everything, it seemed, with the flatness of someone for whom language was a practical instrument rather than a performance. The broth was getting cold. He had a prep list to finish before his shift ended. Tomorrow he would make something different. He had been thinking about the root vegetables from Deck 4's supply. Maybe a proper stew rather than a stock. Maybe she would be hay. Maybe not. The question cost him nothing. She understood, In the part of her that had been matriarch for long enough to read people at significant distance, that it genuinely cost him nothing. He was not being brave. He was not offering something with awareness of its weight. He was asking if she would like to eat here again tomorrow because he would be making food anyway and there was no reason not to pour 2 bowls. She nodded. Once. Her antlers were still lowered. She could not raise them while he was this close. She had tried. The biology was polite about it, in the way that very old and very certain systems were polite, which was to say it simply did not respond to her instructions. She nodded. He nodded back. He stood up. He collected both bowls, carried them to the sink, washed them with the particular efficiency of someone who had washed thousands of bowls and did not think about washing bowls, the motion entirely automatic, hands moving through the sequence while his mind was apparently on the prep list he had returned to reading on the wall. He dried the bowls, put them back in their place on the shelf. He wiped the counter with the cloth draped over his shoulder. Normal. Utterly. Completely, devastatingly normal. Her antlers were rising again. Slowly. Achingly. In both the physical and non-physical sense of that word. Now that he was at the far counter, now that the heat from his forearm was no longer within immediate range, the biology was releasing its hold degree by degree. The old architecture of her composure reasserting itself the way displaced water found its level. She watched the antlers rise in the reflection of the window above the sink. Somewhere outside, the younger guard had filed an incident report. She would learn this later. It would simply read, "She lowered her antlers. I did not move. Please advise." He passed her chair on the way to the cold storage, close enough that the air moved slightly. "Broth's better the second day," he said, mostly to himself. An observation for the prep list and the stew he was already planning and the general philosophy of stocks, which he appeared to hold specific opinions about. The kitchen door opened and closed. Her antlers were at full height. The guards exhaled, both of them, a sound she was not supposed to have heard from this distance. She heard it. She looked at the chair beside her. He had left it where it was, not pushed back to the wall where it had lived for 4 years, not returned to its storage position. Left at the table, angled toward her chair, the cushion bearing the fresh indent of a person's weight. Not empty, not precisely occupied, something between the two that had not existed before this evening. She looked at the indent in the cushion for a long moment. Then she looked at the door. The next evening, same kitchen, ovens running because no one had thought to turn them off. The same particular warmth that asked nothing of anyone. She arrived first. The chair was where he had left it. She had not asked anyone to move it. She had not asked anyone to clean the armrest. She sat in her chair, which was her chair, and she looked at his chair, which had been the empty chair and was now, apparently, his chair, and she did not touch it. She waited. He arrived at the start of his shift, the way people arrived when they were not thinking about arriving, opened the cold storage, read the prep list, pulled out the root vegetables from deck 4, and began. Tonight a stew. He had clearly been thinking about it. He did not acknowledge her presence with any particular ceremony. He said something under his breath that might have been a greeting and might have been an observation about the ventilation system, and began dicing the vegetables with the same steady, unhurried strokes. He made a stew. He poured 2 bowls. He sat in his chair. She ate. He ate. Neither of them spoke. Her fur reached toward him along both arms. She did not press it down. Her antlers lowered faster tonight. The biology remembered. It had, apparently, been waiting for this, and now that it had confirmation, it moved with more certainty. The bone-white arcs descended in the kitchen light until they were nearly level. The full descent, the posture she had not held in 1,400 days. The older guard, the one who had served her for 11 years, stepped back from the door. Not negligence. He moved back 3 additional feet, enough to give the people in the kitchen the texture of privacy without abandoning his post. He had served for 11 years. He understood that some things happened above rank and outside protocol and still needed to be allowed to happen because the alternative was a matriarch who ate alone forever. He said nothing to the younger guard. The younger guard, watching him, also said nothing. At the table, the cook finished his stew and rested his forearms on the surface in the easy way of someone not thinking about his forms. He had 11 systems and bone-white antlers and 4 years of silence. He had a chair and a spoon. It was enough. If that stayed with you, it was meant to. You belong here. Come back tomorrow. There's always another story waiting.